Talking about ancient Rome is incredibly difficult. Sooner or later, we all think about it often. Golden eagles, aqueducts, and more have been turned by politicians, ideologists, artists, and mass culture into a completely independent image. Roman culture, the Roman army, Roman law, and the Roman world with its Latin language first never disappeared from medieval manuscripts, and now they are ever present on our screens. But what if I told you that Roman architecture, Roman cities, Roman religion, ceramics, engineering achievements, theater, state traditions, and even clothing and daily life are not really Roman at all? What if Rome, the greatest civilization of antiquity, is actually secondary? And yes, I know you might be thinking about the Greeks, but I'm not talking about them at all right now. After all, there are many things in Roman culture that we associate solely with Rome. But what if most of them were borrowed by Rome from another civilization? A mysterious and poorly understood one, the Etruscans. Hello everyone, my name is Pavel, and today we will talk about the pre-Roman urban civilization on the Apennine Peninsula. And no, this is not about the Greek colonies. The Etruscans were a civilization that flourished for centuries, from the 10th century BC all the way up to the 1st century BC, before becoming part of the Roman Republic. Today, we will explore how Italy's first great civilization was originally superior to Rome in every way, why it disappeared, and why you probably know nothing about it. Along the way, we'll touch on topics such as propaganda in the ancient world, pop science as performed by Benito Mussolini, and the failures of the most advanced modern technologies. The true first Rome. The land of the Etruscans, Etruria, was a vast region by Italian standards. Just look at the map. Etruscan influence was felt as far as the Adriatic coast, south of the Venetian lagoon, and in the Bay of Naples. But the heart of this civilization was in the valley between the Tiber and Arno rivers. Not far from Rome, the nearest Etruscan city, Veii, was only 11 kilometers away. A couple of hours walk and you would be literally in another civilization, something only possible nowadays in D&D. Notice I avoid the word state. The Etruscans didn't have it in the way that we understand it. Etruria was a confederation of city-states, culturally similar but politically independent. A typical story for the area in the Mediterranean in the first millennium BC. You also have to understand that the 11 kilometers from Etruscan Veii to Rome was more like 11 kilometers from Rome to Veii. Why? Because at that time, the Eternal City was a backwater village on the outskirts of Etruria, not the other way around. No grand buildings, just clay huts in a swamp by the Tiber River. If you lived in this area in Italy and were betting on who would build the Colosseum, devise a legal system, and conquer Egypt, you would bet on the Etruscans. The Romans, it seems, thought so too, and borrowed everything they could from their northern neighbor. This process is called acculturation. The Greeks, along with the Etruscans, gave much of their cultural talents to the Romans, giving these backwoods swamp dwellers a real boost in developing their civilization. More on this later. From Cicero, we know that the Romans studied Etruscan religious rituals. From them came Roman lightning and bird auguries. This included an influential priesthood of augurs who interpreted omens. Without their divinations, most major political events like wars and appointments to high political offices were not legitimized. Strictly speaking, the augurs were literally political officials themselves. So how is legitimizing decisions based on correctly interpreted entrails or coffee grounds worse than a hereditary dictator declaring that the source of his power is the people? Yet, in our progressive times, the leader of every other country does just that. The Roman pantheon, though we associate it with heroes from the game Hades, was almost entirely Etruscan. Even the contemporary computer game Hades is based on Greek mythology. The entire Capitoline Triad, or the top three Roman deities, Jupiter, Minerva, and Juno, were imports. Even Greek cults like Apollos reached Rome via Etruria. A great deal of Greek influence entered Rome through the more advanced Etruscans. An exceptional contribution of the Etruscans to Roman culture was the gift of theater, which Etruscans borrowed from the Greeks. This included the entertainment itself, the plays, and the design of the theaters. With the Etruscans teaching the wild Romans the high art of theater, they were able to convert theater to the use of Latin. Romans themselves believed their comedy came from Etruscans. Some Latin words associated with theater are of Etruscan origin. Actor, histrio, for example. On the ruins of Etruscan settlements, you can find plenty of theatrical masks. And damn, they look really cool. Take note for Halloween. Etruscan Bucera pottery is still found throughout the Mediterranean. It was the Etruscan potters who taught the Romans how to make tasteful pottery. We'll return to pottery later. Yes, I know, nothing sounds duller than pottery history. But here, it's actually fun. For now, let's continue our checklist of cultural borrowings. The Roman arch, the foundation of Roman architectural style, was likely Etruscan. Urban planning with grid streets, sewage systems, forums, aqueducts, and running water in places like Pompeii, all Etruscan. Roman temple architecture, an Etruscan invention, as were burial urns, tumulus necropolises, and so on. It might seem nothing could be more Roman than gladiator fights in an amphitheater. However, Roman historians wrote about the Etruscan origins of gladiators. And I don't know how to tell you this, but even the toga is just a variant of Etruscan attire. Now for something really important. You use this thing every day, but you probably rarely think about its connection to antiquity. The letters you use to communicate and write toxic comments on the internet. The first alphabet was invented by the Phoenicians. It changed hands several times before reaching Rome. First, the Greeks adopted it. In Greece, more letters were added, making it fit the Greek language. Then, it passed through Phoenician colonies and eventually reached Etruria through southern Italy. The Etruscans took the Greek alphabet, removed everything unnecessary, and began writing everything down with it. Only after that did the alphabet reach the Romans, and they added a few letters, for example, G. Today, 2.5 billion people use the Latin alphabet. Linguistic influence wasn't limited to alphabetical transit. Hundreds of Etruscan borrowed words entered the Latin lexicon: persona, ceremonia, and even miles, meaning soldier, hence the term military. Three-part names like Gaius Julius Caesar, yep, also from Etruscans. It doesn't stop there though. Even personal names like Italian name Marco is an Etruscan borrowing, and Slavic name Sergei might be as well. It even got to the point where Etruscans simply began ruling Rome. According to tradition, the last three of Rome's 7 kings were from Etruria. Many of Rome's earliest state traditions were imports. The lictors, Roman officials, appeared under the Etruscan kings, and their special seats, the curule chairs, too. The royal tradition itself likely didn't arise spontaneously. Each of the 3 Etruscan kings engaged in monumental urbanism. All the aforementioned urban innovations, including the Great Temple on the Capitoline Hill, Capitol itself, were achievements of Etruscan engineering. It transformed Rome from a village into a city. Today, Capitol Hill is the center of American democracy, thousands of kilometers away from Etruria. Behind the podium in the US House of Representatives hangs a double-headed axe tied in a bundle of wooden rods, fasces. You'll also find them on the railings of the Summer Garden in St. Petersburg and on the coat of arms of France. The term fascism comes from their name. Originally, it was just a symbol of royal power in Rome, brought by the Etruscans. Some researchers believe that the monarchical period in Roman history was nothing more than a period of Etruscan political domination. It is an enticing thought, but let's remember that the Roman monarchy is half mythology, and the Etruscan dynasty is a modern concept. After all, we don't need Etruscan conquest to explain Etruscan influence on Roman statehood. Just the same, Greek conquest doesn't explain Roman culture. Finally, Egyptian conquest does not explain the cult of Isis. A modern example, McDonald's popularity worldwide happened without US military intervention in those countries. Just as fast food became popular, Etruscan customs became popular in their time. Rome itself was never an Etruscan city. The Romans never stopped speaking Latin, which distinguished them from the Etruscan Confederation. Despite shared customs, the Romans always belonged to a different cultural sphere, the Latin one. No matter how significant the Etruscan influence on Rome was, they often merely passed on the latest trends from the wider world to their younger brother. In many ways, the Etruscans had their own unique culture, much of which the Romans would later claim as their own. However, the Etruscans themselves, of course, were heavily influenced by the Hellenistic world. Greece was everywhere. This is evident, for example, in sculpture. The most famous Etruscan artifact, the sarcophagus of the spouses, is thoroughly Greek archaic, even down to the eerie smile. In general, early Rome and Etruria are inseparable. Not necessarily identical, but so closely intertwined that it is impossible to talk about one without mentioning the other. The Romans likely didn't even realize what they had borrowed from the north and what they had come up with themselves. Heaven forbid that they were copyright and trademark attorneys running around trying to protect every fresh idea. Nothing would have gotten done in this beautifully fluid intellectual environment. And this played a cruel joke on the Etruscans. Genocide or assimilation? The Etruscans lived so close to Rome that they disappeared almost at the start of its history. Most of Etruscan culture is buried under Roman ruins. To get to the Etruscans, you have to literally dig through the entire Roman layer, in both the archaeological and anthropological sense. Rome, of course, experienced so much that afterward only the courageous few had been interested in how it all started. It's hard to imagine that Latin civilization might have had alternatives. When you look at a map and see Roman cities in Palestine and Britain, it's hard to picture a time when Rome was playing second fiddle in Italy itself. Most people would easily put two and two together. If we had a highly influential civilization and then it encountered a competitor in the Romans, we would know almost nothing about it. That would mean Rome destroyed it, right? After all, it's well known that the inhabitants of the Eternal City are among the top conquerors of all time. But things are a little bit more complicated. Yes, conquest was involved, but can we call it destruction? The decline of Etruscan civilization began in the early 4th century BC, when conflicts with Rome led to the siege of Veii. Many historians consider this the first expansion of Roman power beyond the hills and swamps near the Tiber River. The Roman historian Livy described the siege of Veii as it were the siege of Troy. Most likely, it was more like a local village skirmish. Later, the conflict would escalate, ending with the Roman hegemony. The Etruscan kings were expelled by the Romans back in the 6th century BC, and they would pride themselves on this for another 5 centuries, until they reinvented monarchy. The Etruscans became victims of a fairly prosaic territorial expansion. The winner was the one who settled better. In our case, Rome. Rome was at the crossroads between the Greek south and the Etruscan north. The hills served as fortresses, and the Tiber provided great access to trade. The more confident Rome became, the more it forgot that everything it took pride in was taken from the Etruscans. Some Roman historians remembered this, but here's the thing. Etruscan civilization was written about by people who lived 500 years after its decline. Who would remember much? Also, they hadn't yet invented those wolf memes saying, "Be an alpha wolf, don't forget who taught you how to howl at the moon." Speaking of wolves, guess where the Capitoline wolf came running into Roman culture from? Rome completed the conquest of Etruria in the mid-3rd century BC. The last Etruscan city was destroyed during a slave uprising. In 90 BC, the Etruscans received Roman citizenship. Most Etruscan inscriptions disappeared by the 1st century BC. Apparently, around the same time, the spoken language died out as well. Its last speakers were likely antiquarians and language collectors, rather than native Etruscans. The question of whether the disappearance of the Etruscans can be considered a conquest or assimilation or even genocide remains open. Traditionally, it's believed that the first genocide in history was the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. This included mass slaughter and salting the earth. How symbolic that was is also a matter of debate. And curses! Then, people usually recall the persecution of Jews during the Jewish Wars, and so on down a very long list. We won't even get into the context in which the term genocide was coined and why it's meaningless to apply it to ancient history. That's not even the point. The disappearance of the Etruscans didn't happen in a single day, year, or even a century. There were wars, but Etruscan leaders calmly switched sides, became Roman aristocracy, and gradually dissolved into the Pax Romana. Some Roman emperors belonged to ancient Etruscan families, and no one considered it a foreign invasion. There was an Etruscan quarter in Rome, and Etruscan priests were still revered as interpreters of divine omens. No one was destroyed or forced into anything. The Romans didn't consign Etruscan cities to oblivion, as they unsuccessfully tried to do so with Carthage. It would have been impossible after all. They shared one culture, one set of gods, everything. Centuries of Etruscan influence had left their mark. Eventually, the Romans began to see everything imported from neighboring villages as their own. Etruscan art became indistinguishable from Roman art, and it truly became Roman. There was no more Etruscan culture, no Etruscan speakers, no Etruscan cities, and the Etruscans joined the ranks of the, quote, lost civilizations. Those that perish in floods endlessly build their pyramids and captivate everyone's interest. The Etruscans occupy a special place in this group. We know why they disappeared, but when it comes to where they came from, what language they spoke, and why they were so influential, we have only theories, guesses, and many mysteries. A lost civilization. And so we leave the world of historical facts and sail into the open sea of historical speculation. Finally. In essence, there are two types of lost civilizations. Those that are so unlike us that we suspect them of alien origins. Then there are those that are just like us, only better. The Etruscans fit into both categories. Very little is known about the Etruscan civilization, except that it existed, and that without it, Rome might have had remained a dreary village. The Etruscan language resists decipherment. There are almost no primary written sources. We have to rely mainly on tombstones. Essentially, it's like judging a civilization by graffiti on walls. You can form a basic impression, but you can't dive deep. Early Roman priests probably studied Etruscan religious texts in translation, but they haven't survived. Usually, the Etruscans wrote on perishable materials, and their texts were preserved only by miracle. An Etruscan book of 1,350 words is the longest known Etruscan text, a true long read. For comparison, the US Declaration of Independence has 1,320 words, and that's far from the longest political document in the world, to say the least. Fragments survived because the linen on which the text was written was used to wrap a mummy. And this wasn't even literature. The mentioned book, for example, is a ritual calendar. September 26th should be dedicated to sacrifices to Neptune, that sort of thing. But even that is great, because more typical Etruscan texts are inscriptions like, quote, "This was given by this person to that person." Roadside signs along the lines of city boundary, and tombstones. Such and such, son of such and such, lived this many years. Had there been narrative prose with complex grammar and syntax like Beowulf, and I'm not talking about the bad Zemeckis movie, but the English epic, but alas. Roman texts occasionally mention Etruscan literature, but no examples have been found. And although it's tempting to invent some mystical story about this, the lack of texts in such a situation is not unusual. The same goes for the Sabines, another Italic people neighboring Rome. Only 2 or 3 Sabine inscriptions have survived. Archaeologists are probably thrilled by such an abundance. And the fewer data we have, the harder it is to analyze the language and consequently decipher it. The same problem exists with the potential Trojan language, linear A script. Another sad consequence of having so few sources is that absolutely every existing theory about the origin of the Etruscans is flawed. In the end, everything we know about their language and origin is shrouded in mystery, on par with Lovecraftian plots or the question of where those darn socks go after disappearing from the washing machine. And brace yourselves, things are about to get a bit tricky. We know that the Etruscans were definitely around in the 7th century BC. Not much help, right? We also know that their language is non-Indo-European. But which one is it exactly? That's the mystery. This is curious because the Indo-European language family connects, say, Ancient Greek and Belarusian, Nepali with German, Ossetian with Latin itself. And here, right in the middle of Europe, in Italy, we have something unrelated to all of this. It seems that the only related languages to Etruscan were founded in the Hellenistic region, Rhetic in the Alps, and Lemnian from the island of Lemnos in the Aegean Sea. But just so you understand how little we know about these languages, consider this. Etruscan has more surviving sources than these two combined. There's a theory that these people spoke version of the same pre-Indo-European language family. In other words, these were languages that miraculously survived the Indo-European linguistic wave in the 2nd millennium BC. If this is true, then these people were true rarities, unlike anyone else. People understood these oddities back in antiquity too, but no one was particularly interested in diving into linguistic nuances. The ancient Greeks and Romans were like modern-day English speakers. They knew nothing beyond what their mom taught them. It seems there was only one high-ranking linguistic enthusiast in the ancient world who bothered to learn the Etruscan gibberish, Emperor Claudius. And even then, probably because he was married to an Etruscan woman. The Greeks called Etruscans Tyrrhenians or Tyrsenians, hence the name of the neighboring sea, Tyrrhenian. And as with other barbarians and semi-barbarians, they attributed to them a mythological origin from some hero who sailed from east to the west. It's an idea that the Romans would later echo. If people speak such a strange language, they must be from far away and definitely not locals. After all, the locals, that's us. Later, scientific interpretations were layered into this concept, allegedly. The Eastern goods found in Etruria arrived together with the Etruscans themselves. That is, pots with Eastern ornaments were supposedly evidence of migration, not trade. But you know, clay pots aren't people. We can't equate material culture similarity with kinship. Most likely, the goods with Eastern ornamentation in Etruria are the result of Bronze Age globalization, when the civilized world from Mesopotamia and Egypt to Crete and Italy was interconnected in a way it wouldn't be for hundreds of years. By the way, leave a comment if you're interested in a video about how globalization once collapsed under its own weight, about the Bronze Age catastrophe. By the way, the Etruscans are sometimes blamed for this catastrophe. They're said to be the sea people who wiped out the archaic Bronze Age civilizations with their invasions. But that's unlikely because the Etruscans were terrible as nomadic pirates. These guys were way too advanced for raiding. They would have left their cultural traces everywhere. But we can't find any of it. In general, I don't recommend becoming a, quote, lost civilization. You'll either be shamelessly mythologized or you'll be blamed for some global catastrophe. The idea of the Etruscans traveling far from the east sounds realistic overall. In the Mediterranean, there is at least one people who mastered maritime colonization at a professional level back in the Bronze Age: the Phoenicians. From the colonies in modern-day Tunisia, from Carthage to Phoenicia in the Middle East, it's more than 2,000 kilometers. And it worked out just fine. The cultural transit went smoothly. Let's not even start with the Greeks. In short, why couldn't the Etruscan be another colonizing people? This idea sounded logical 2,500 years ago and still does now. And in general, history is full of examples of two or more dissimilar people, including in language, living side by side. Just look at the Caucasus or modern-day California. The main creator of the Etruscan myth was the Greek historian Herodotus. According to him, the legend goes like this. Lydia, a country in the western part of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. The local king Attis sent his son Tyrrhenos into exile. Tyrrhenos, accompanied by a group of Lydian immigrants, sailed west to Italy. And lo and behold, we have Etruscans teaching wild Romans all sorts of things. Herodotus, by the way, added some fun to his epic narrative. Allegedly, the Lydians invented dice on their ships to distract themselves from hunger. As if we didn't already have enough Etruscan inventions. The legend was picked up by the Roman historian Strabo. He claimed that the Etruscans came from Imbros and Lemnos, islands in the Aegean Sea. If you visit the Archaeological Museum in Athens, check out the Lemnos stele. What's written on it, it's completely unclear, but the language seems similar to Etruscan. Supporters of the quote Eastern theory consider this an argument, obviously. Lemnos was just one of the stops on the way to Italy, and look how far it is from Etruria. Later, the Etruscan migration was explained by a collapse of the Hittite Empire, which was also in Anatolia. And yes, the timing roughly matches. But this is most likely just Lydian propaganda, mainly because the Lydian language, unlike Etruscan, is definitely Indo-European. Moreover, at that time, Lydian kings were actively trading with the cities of Etruria. The story of the kinship between the two people conveniently helped strengthen economic ties. Good old Herodotus was probably just tricked. Well, he was no stranger to that. After all, he wasn't hired as a chronicler, and he mostly just told interesting stories. The quote, father of history didn't live to see the rise of comparative linguistics by about 23 centuries. I don't know if you noticed, but the most interesting thing here is that this topic was being discussed 2,500 years ago, and the debates were no less heated than today's at Italian archaeological symposiums. Herodotus' take was supported by Thucydides, while Dionysius of Halicarnassus declared that the Etruscans were native to Italy. They still haven't reached an agreement. In 2004, Italian scientists started extracting mitochondrial DNA from Etruscan tombs, but they immediately faced criticism. Working with ancient DNA is terribly difficult, and the results are rarely straightforward. Just keep in mind that the technology in this field develops much more slowly than artificial intelligence. If anyone tries to sell you the idea that modern analysis methods can tell us everything about the past through the power of science, they can't. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, so scientists later unexpectedly turned to cows, studying samples from cows in different parts of the Mediterranean to test the Eastern theory of Etruscan origin. We found out that the genome of cows in Etruria is similar to the genome of cows grazing in Anatolia, Turkey. But even this doesn't particularly convince anyone. People are not only not clay pots, but they're also not cows. All of this doesn't stop some scholars from continuing to side with Herodotus. It's amusing to think that the ancient Lydians simply spun some tales for the wandering historian, and now we're sequencing DNA because of it. The alternative, and seemingly more popular theory, is that the Etruscans are an indigenous culture of central Italy, whose roots go back literally to the first Homo sapiens in this region. Etruscan culture as such arose around 700 BC, but related archaeological culture apparently existed here pretty much always. In this debate, there are also compromise advocates. They argue that at least the Etruscan elite was foreign, while the common folk were native Italians. In any case, traditional skepticism towards Herodotus' version is slowly fading. Let's see, maybe soon there will be more convincing evidence. Etruscology is a very popular field. It seems that today, every second archaeologist, at least in Italy, is getting into Etruscan studies. In 2022, whole caches of Etruscan bronze statues were discovered. So stay tuned, as they say. But for now, the general consensus seems to be that the Etruscans were true millennia-old natives. Italy for the Etruscans. And if you think I was joking, what will you say about the people who took the slogan very seriously? Both supporters and opponents. You see, if the first surge of interest in the Etruscans was in antiquity, the second came in the 19th century, thanks to large-scale excavations during the rise of nationalism. Back then, the main popularizer of Herodotus' version was the Briton George Dennis. He told the European public that Etruscan art, religion, and political system all came from the East. It's a classic case of Orientalism, when we see something exotic and we look for roots in the East. In this sense, 19th century Britons weren't much different from the ancient Greeks. Dennis called the contents of Etruscan tombs Second Pompeii, and all this, of course, greatly impressed the readers. Any statement to the effect that Etruscan culture was of Italian origin, Dennis dismissed as, quote, nationalist drum beating. And indeed, in the mid-19th century, Italian historians embraced the myth of the Etruscans as an unconquered and independent nation, a league of city-states united by a love of freedom. The usual story. On the eve of Italy's unification, the connection between a great past and a desired future became of great interest to everyone. After the Risorgimento, the idea that the Etruscans were indigenous Italians became even more popular. Etruscan virtues, their style and influence were claimed as the origins of Italian culture, and Herodotus was simply mistaken, they said. Even Benito Mussolini, who considered himself and his country the heirs of the Roman Empire, sought to appropriate the Etruscan legacy. Remember that fasces are the Etruscan symbol? In 1922, the medieval city of Corneto was renamed Tarquinia, after its ancient name. The renaming ceremony turned into a fascist demonstration. After that, Italian universities experienced a boom in Etruscan studies. It was evidence of Italian cultural superiority. And you'd think they already had Roman civilization. But no, apparently that was Greek borrowed culture, but the Etruscans, supposedly indigenous, truly and purely Italian. Overlooking the fact that the Etruscans themselves actively borrowed much from the Greeks. Still, we have to thank Italian fascists for the development and popularization of Etruscan studies. Without their nationalistic fervor, we might still believe Herodotus. But after World War II, research slowed down. Everyone was sick of identity politics and the idealization of the past. But today, no one remembers the Mussolini influence on Etruscan studies. And thank goodness. Today, the Etruscans disappeared from history more than 2,000 years ago, but remain incredibly popular. In the Arena Chapel in Padua, Italy, the Great Giotto depicted Satan, who strongly resembled an Etruscan demon. Italian sculptors often reference Etruscan models. In 1976, Michelangelo Pistoletto, a member of the Art Povera group, created an installation where a copy of an Etruscan statue was reflected in a mirror, creating a kind of dialogue between the past and the present. But it's not just about high art. The design of the soccer ball for the 1990 World Cup in Italy referenced Etruscan ornaments. In 1994, Silvio Berlusconi built a massive mausoleum at his home near Milan. This imitation of Etruscan princely necropolises contained items the media mogul wanted to take with him to the next life. However, the building was declared illegally constructed. Disney once released a special series of comics where Mickey Mouse was an Etruscan. Every summer in August, a popular wine festival is held in the renamed Mussolini Tarquinia, and many restaurants in Tuscany and Lazio are called Ristorante Etrusco. In those places, people sometimes say you inherited Etruscan facial features, meaning particularly long nose and high cheekbones. Etruscan identity is attractive because it implies deep regional roots, which is very important to many conservative Italians. And remember, I mentioned the rebirth of Etruscan pottery at the very beginning of the video. Well, many people have fragments of Etruscan antiquity at home because there is a lot of it, and it went unnoticed for a long time. Not like it's Rome or something. In post-war times, Etruscan pottery was even used as unofficial currency. According to eyewitnesses, doctors and lawyers were offered 2,000-year-old pots as payment. Now that is how you build a civilization, folks. Today, Etruscan necropolises are of course under UNESCO protection. You can visit and take photos, just don't try to take any pots with you. Some residents of the Umbria region in Italy still claim to have Etruscan ancestry. DNA studies seem to confirm this, so if anyone was worried about the Etruscan genome, you can relax. It almost certainly exists in you if you were born somewhere near the vineyards of Tuscany. You should feel proud. However, it's better to take pride in belonging to the human race itself, which, once it creates something cool and significant, almost never fully loses it. We might forget even such basics as origins and language. Thousands of years may pass, but we will still encounter the ancient legacy of the cultures that came before us, even if it's in completely different people, stories, and context. The work of human hands never disappears without a trace, and I tend to feel optimistic about that, more than anything else. Thank you all for watching, dear friends. If you were also surprised about how much the Etruscans influenced modern culture, please leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed our story about the past, please help us move forward by subscribing to the channel, hitting the bell icon, and sharing this video. If you really enjoyed content like this, then please support us on Patreon. It would help us bring you even more fascinating videos about history and culture. And we'll see you in the next episode.